Hello everybody. I'm currently sitting in my greenhouse, so I'm hoping we won't get too much doggy background noise. We may get some wind background noise because it's quite a windy day, but it's actually pleasantly warm in my greenhouse. I need to get one of those greenhouse thermometers, mostly out of like nosiness / interest than out of any concern over whether or not my plants are going to get too hot, because I mean, let's face it, I live in Inverness, so I think even on the hottest day of the year, I think it's unlikely that my plants are going to cook in my greenhouse. But yeah, I would definitely be interested to know how hot it gets in here at various points. It's quite balmy in here right now, albeit I'm sitting here with 2 sweaters and a coat on, so it's maybe not quite as balmy as I think it is. But I wanted to pop on this week to talk about my raised bed building, which is a bit of a work in progress. I'm literally sitting looking at it even as we speak, so it's not yet finished, but I thought I'll talk about where I'm at this point, and then what I might do in the next couple of weeks when it's actually finished is do a blog post about it with sort of more pictures and whatnot. But yeah, it's a bit of a beast. I'm not gonna lie. So when we first moved into this house, the whole of the back garden was one giant vegetable patch, or had been in the past. The people that we bought it from, George was the sort of husband, George and Sheena, and I think Sheena had died a few years previously, and then George had sadly gone into a home, but George, I think, was quite a big big gardener. I was about to say vegetable grower. I guess he was a vegetable grower. Yeah, he was quite into his garden, and the whole of the back garden was one giant vegetable patch. It was like basically like an allotment, I guess, but in his back garden. So it was a bit of a shame when we first moved in, because in an ideal world I would have probably kept it like that. Maybe not all for veg, but kept it as a sort of more like plants and vegetables and flowers and things like that, and less grass. But ultimately we have 2 doggies. Actually at the moment we have 3, because we've got a new failed guide dog come to live with us, and so we needed somewhere dog safe for them to sort of toilet, basically. So the back garden where the veg bed was the safest part of the garden, because it was well enclosed. The front garden needs a fence put round it, so the front garden's probably more interesting from a doggy point of view, more things to kind of snuffle and shrubbery to get lost in and things like that, but yeah, there's no fence, so they could very easily get out onto the road, whereas the back garden is more of just like a plain rectangle with very little plants and things in it, but it is securely fenced on all sides. So we were quite quickly like, right, we need to lay lawn in the back garden so that the dogs can play out there and toilet out there. And we knew when we moved in that if we left it as one giant veg bed, just basically like bare soil, with a few sort of straggly plants kind of clinging on, that if we left it out there like that over the winter, it would just turn into a bog, and then the dogs would churn it up and be constantly bringing mud and things into the house. So yeah, we were like, it's better to just lay some turf, and then hopefully the turf survives the winter, and then in time we'll add borders and interest with like plants and things once we've got the fence replaced, because the fence on one side of the garden also needs replaced. It's dog proof enough, but it's definitely quite rotten, and a few of the panels are coming away and whatnot, so we're just in the process of getting quotes to get that done. So I can't really do any planting along the borders until we know better what's going on with the fence, but the turf so far has survived the winter. It's definitely looking a bit sad and patchy in places, and the bits that haven't been walked on are definitely sort of happier and healthier and growing away more strongly than the bits that have been walked on regularly. So Andrew's constantly out there staring at the grass and being like, oh, we shouldn't be walking on it, and it's like, yeah, but the whole point is it's a garden that we use, right? It's a garden that the dogs can run around in. So yeah, it's looking a little bit sad and yellow in places, and there's definitely some bits that we're going to need to put some seed down, but for the most part it's survived the winter, which is good. The other benefit of this garden is it came with a greenhouse, which is where I'm currently sitting, which is on my to-do list to wash, because it definitely has not been cleaned in quite a long time. And that is definitely moving up my agenda for March, because we're getting into that time of year where I can actually start planting seeds. Everywhere I read, it's like, March is the time to start planting, but I think up here, from what I've read and spoken to other people who have gardens, it's actually worth holding off till later in March/early April, because we're more likely to get sort of frosts and more cold spells and things like that up here. So I'm not sweating it about planting seeds in March, but I would like to get cracking so that, you know, come the 1st of April I can start making moves on that kind of stuff. So I want to wash the greenhouse down, because it's looking quite algaeified in places, and there were quite a lot of weeds growing in the greenhouse when we first moved in, so I pulled all the weeds out so I can make use of the actual kind of growing space, but a lot of them have left marks on the glass, so I need to get all that cleaned and whatnot. And then in front of the greenhouse, between our new lawn and the house, there's another veg bed, but this veg bed's sort of sunken into the patio, so there's a kind of L-shaped patio, and the longer part of the L has a big sort of hole in it, as it were, like an intentional hole, a square hole, where George had, I think, herbs and things, and there were a couple of sorry, I'm drinking coffee while I record this, not very professional. Yeah, he had herbs, and I had to move some red currants when we laid the lawn, so I had the red currants kind of healed in there, and there was a rhubarb patch as well. So I've moved half the rhubarb into a sort of sunny, slightly shady, but I think it'll cope, touch wood, area just to the right of the driveway. So when I drive onto my driveway at the moment, I can see my rhubarb coming through, which I'm not going to lie is a real little source of joy. Very much enjoying that. And then the other half of the rhubarb I've been potting up and either giving away, so I'm going to give one pot to my neighbours, one pot's gone to my father-in-law, one pot's gone to a guy at work who said he would trade me nasturtium seeds but has not yet, so I don't want to chase him, that would be mean, but you know, you're like, I want to grow nasturtiums, Simon, bring me my seeds. And then I think I'll still have 2 pots of rhubarb left, so I'm actually thinking once I built the raised bed, I'm going to put the rhubarb back in the raised bed, so I won't be putting all my rhubarb eggs in one basket, basically. So if the rhubarb that I've planted beside the driveway doesn't come away, I'll have a second lot in the raised bed that's basically growing in the original site, so I assume would do well. But the reason I want to put a raised bed in is kind of twofold. The first one is just sort of on a practical level for me, that having spent quite a lot of time over the years gardening in my granny's garden, she has several veg beds, but they're all at sort of ground level, and obviously to get down and like weed them and whatnot, you have to be literally down on your hands and knees, and it's fine, like I'm young and fit and healthy and like I can do it, but it's not the most enjoyable, if I'm honest. And it is like, it's a bit sore on your knees, it's a bit sore on your back. I find it quite sore, like kind of twice on my knees, because you get the sort of pressure on the front of your knee, but also I don't know if this is because I run, but I often find I get kind of knee cramp when I'm like kneeling for any length of time, and I never used to experience that, so I'm putting it down to running and not age, because that running is slightly less depressing than age, but either way I find kneeling down for long periods of time to weed quite uncomfortable, and I know myself that if it's uncomfortable I'm probably not going to want to do it as regularly as it should be done, and so I'd always thought when I have my own garden I'm going to do raised beds. But these raised beds are actually quite tall, because the thing I've observed with people with raised beds is often they're only like 20 centimetres off the ground. And it's not that different to just being on the ground, to be honest. Like, you're still kneeling down, you're still bending with your back in like awkward positions and whatnot. It's still quite sore ultimately. So I was like, I don't feel that raised beds that are only like, a few inches off the ground are really that dissimilar to just planting directly into the ground. Like, obviously you get the benefits of having a bit more control over the soil medium, right? So if your soil's a bit rubbish where you live and you build raised beds, then obviously you can, you know, mix in more organic matter and they hold the water better and all that kind of stuff. So there are other benefits, but I think from just a purely practical, not having to kneel and bend quite as much, I always thought I want taller raised beds. I want raised beds of the type that you see in sort of community gardens so that people don't have to bend down as much. So I've done mine, they're 72 centimetres tall, so they're basically hip height. So the idea, we'll see if this works in practice, but the idea is that I don't have to bend too much to like kneel and, to weed and whatnot, and I certainly don't have to kneel. My concern is that obviously if I plant things in the raised beds that grow upwards, so I'm thinking like sweet peas or runner beans, then they might grow so tall that I then have to stand on a step or a step ladder or whatever to harvest things, which would feel a little bit ridiculous. But for the most part, things I'm thinking about putting in the raised bed at this point are like herbs, strawberries, rhubarb, carrots, onions and garlic, albeit that'll be later in the year, radishes, salads. None of these grow particularly tall, so I think it should be okay. I mean, worst case scenario, I want to grow something taller in there, then yeah, I can stand on a step ladder to harvest stuff or whatever. But I feel like you're harvesting or pruning or tying in a lot less frequently than you are weeding. So overall, it would still be a benefit to have them higher up. The second reason I wanted high raised beds is because the aforementioned dogs. So because the raised beds are in a sort of the doggy part of the garden, which is also the part of the garden that gets the most sun, so it is the part of the garden that makes the most sense to have veg and fruit and things in. The downside is that when the doggies are charging around, there's going to be a risk of them like crashing into sort of plants that are grown at ground level. So I'm definitely, when I'm planting up the borders along the edges, I'm definitely going to have to think hard about at what point do I plant things out. Like if I'm growing stuff from seed, I maybe need to leave it in pots for longer than would be ideal, because once it's in the ground there's more of a chance that it's going to get trampled by dogs, albeit they don't tend to run along the borders quite as much, but you know, just to sort of maximise the chances of things surviving. But yeah, so I don't want like fruit and veg especially to get trampled, because obviously you know, sets back the plant, and if the aim is to get harvest from them, then I want to give the maximum chance that they actually produce what I want them to produce. But also the added benefit of them not getting like peed on. Like when I had the rhubarb just in the ground where George had left it, Badger especially has just no respect. Was just like peeing, and I'm not going to lie, pooping several times in the rhubarb bed, and then I was having to either chase him off or clear up after him, and neither are ideal when it's something that ultimately you want to eat, right? So lifting them up out of toileting, sorry if this is a bit TMI, lifting them up out of toileting height is I think just a good shout regardless. And yeah, I want the garden to be a place where I can relax and enjoy what I'm growing, and I just don't want to spend the entire time sort of shouting at the dogs like, careful, off the borders or whatever. Because when we stayed with my in-laws, they have more grass, which the dogs love because they can like run after bulls and stuff, but they have more grass, but they also have the grass kind of intersected by borders. And my mother-in-law especially would spend quite a lot of time like shouting at the dogs to get off the borders. And of course it's confusing for the dogs, because they're like, oh, so I'm allowed on this piece of grass but not on this piece of ground, you know, and these pieces of ground are like, excuse me, right beside each other. Like obviously if you're a dog it's difficult to understand those rules. So I just don't want to be in the garden like constantly shouting at the dogs because they're on the patch of ground that I don't want them to be on, you know. So basically what I've done is I did some research into the types of wood that you can build raised beds from. There's lots of different varieties and opinions and whatnot out there, but one of the key factors for me is that we're going to be able to see this raised bed from the kitchen window. So when you're like cooking or washing up, it's one of the first things you're going to see when you look out the window. So Andrew was very keen that it looked smart. He's quite into a sort of modern minimalist style, which we share in the house, definitely. In the garden, I would personally probably lean more into a kind of cottage garden vibe, partly because that just means you can let things like romp away and not have to worry too much about keeping things in like angular lines and whatnot. But Andrew wants the back garden especially to be quite smart, which I understand because it is the part of the garden that we're going to be like looking at the most, and it's also the part of the garden that we're going to most likely be sitting in a lot as well. So we agreed that the raised bed would have to be made in wood that looked quite smart. When you look online for sort of how to build raised beds, there's loads of videos and blog posts on sort of how to use reclaimed wood from pallets, for example, or sleepers or scaffolding planks, and all of these are great. Obviously I'm all about reduce, reuse, recycle, but they ultimately don't necessarily look that smart. That's not to say they can't look smart. I'm sure there are people out there who've made them look smart, but yeah, there were just a lot of videos about how to reuse, say, pallets where the ultimate outcome wasn't quite the vibe we were going for. So what we've settled on is decking boards, because they've got this quite smart sort of ridged design. I was about to say horizontal design. Obviously that depends on what orientation you use them in, but I'm using them horizontally, so the ridges are horizontal to the ground. And yeah, they look quite smart and quite modern. The ridges are obviously designed to reduce slipping, because for decking you don't want them to be slippery if they get wet or get algae grown on them, but that's not an issue for me because I'm not going to be walking on them. But I just like the ridged kind of look. I think it's quite smart. And then the added benefit of decking boards is that they are pre-treated, because obviously they're designed, it's wood that's designed to be used outside. So they're pre-treated. I think the ones I've got are heat treated rather than treated with chemicals, because I wanted the raised bed obviously is where I'm going to be growing fruit and vegetables. So I think I've spoken about this in the past with my compost bin, that I'm keen to garden organically as much as possible, and I want to think about that in terms of like what I'm treating the wood with as well, because obviously the wood is ultimately going to break down. It's anything that's on the wood or in the wood is potentially going to leach into the soil, and whilst I don't think that would happen to a sort of concentration that would cause us harm, it's like I also don't want to harm like the bacteria and the worms and the insects and things that live in the soil, so I thought heat treated is a good way to go because there's less sort of chemicals to leach out. And then my plan is to treat the inside with a combo of silicone sealant, which was a tip I got from the Lovely Greens, who I'll link in the show notes. So Tanya from the Lovely Greens has a very thriving YouTube channel and website with like loads of video tutorials. I think she's published a book. She's got an online course on how to make soap. She gardens and makes soap and makes like hand creams and things like that. I'd actually quite like to buy myself her soap making course at some point, but if I'm honest, I do not have time at the moment for another hobby. Maybe next winter would be the time to get into that. But I love the idea of like growing things in your garden that you then use to make soap with. But yeah, so anyway, I reached out to Tanya from the Lovely Greens to see how she dealt with her raised beds, and she sent me a link to one of her videos, and she pre-treated the inside before she filled it with a silicone sealant of the type that you use for aquariums and vivariums, so like for fish and reptiles to live in. And there's no fungicide in it, so there's no sort of like chemicals that might damage the biome of the soil or sort of insects and things that are going to live in the soil. It's inert, so again it's not going to harm the soil organisms at all or leach into my plants, but it forms a waterproof sealant. So she'd got this tip from someone on the Isle of Man, which is where she lives, who makes raised beds for a living and seals their raised beds with this silicone sealant, and has said it doubles their lifespan. So if a raised bed might last 5 to 10 years, then it might last 10 to 20 years if you treat it with the silicone, apparently. So I don't know how true that is or how based in science that is, but yeah, this person makes raised beds for a living, the person that gave this advice to Tanya. So yeah, so I figured that was worth trying. And for the princely sum of something like £6 per tube, I bought 2 tubes. I figured all I've wasted is 12 quid and maybe a few hours of my time. But if it potentially doubles, even if it doesn't double, even if it's just like 50% longer, if that's the difference between 5 years and 7 or 8 years, that's still, you know, a lot of extra years before I'd have to consider doing repairs or replacing the raised bed. And then, yeah, so what I've done is used 2x2 pre-treated timber that I've cut to 71 centimetres tall. So there's a little lip of the decking board all the way around that goes higher than the actual posts. And then the decking board I've done in a C shape, which was Andrew's idea, actually. So I could have just done a giant rectangle, which would completely fill the space that the original raised bed was. But the problem is the width of that raised bed, I wouldn't be able to reach the strip in the middle, not without standing on a step or something, or stepping on the soil, neither of which I'd want to do. So Andrew suggested doing it in a sort of C shape, so I can then stand in the sort of the gap in the middle of the C, if that makes sense, and then I should be able to reach the centre of the soil all the way around, either from the outer edge or from the inner edge. And yeah, so that's what I've done. It's obviously a little bit more of a hassle to build than a plain rectangle, but ultimately it came together really easily. Timber is really expensive. I think I talked about this in my compost bin building episode, but the timber for this was slightly more expensive than the compost bin. I used shiplap for the compost bin, and that I think came to about £200 all in. There was another 50 quid of screws and hardware and then shipping, but yeah, I think the actual wood itself is about £200 for the compost bin. The actual wood itself for the raised bed will have been about £250, I think. But it's a massive raised bed, so I don't know how much that would be to have made professionally, but I was about to say, I'm pleased with £250. I'm not pleased. I mean, if it was cheaper, I obviously would have been happier. But ultimately, it is what it is. Like, timber costs a lot. So, and I've gone for quite a smart decking board. I could have made it cheaper if I'd gone for something like sleepers. This is why people use things like sleepers or pallets, because obviously wood is very expensive. But I wanted this raised bed to look smart, so I think the cost was worth it to have a sort of aesthetically pleasing garden. And then in time, I've got other parts of the garden where I might be putting raised beds in the future, and those parts are not directly overlooked. So it might be that when I do the next set, I do sleepers or scaffolding planks, because it will be less important to me that it looks good, because I won't be able to see it directly from my kitchen window. So yeah, I'm currently at the point where I've built all the wood parts, so the whole physical structure is up. I've silicone sealed about 50% of it, which I'm not going to lie, the silicone sealant is quite tricky. It's quite thick to express from the tube, so it comes in a tube much like bathroom sealant, and then you use a sort of sealant gun, like a metal frame with a press handle, and so you load it into the metal frame and then sort of pump the handle, and then it helps the sealant come out in a sort of even way. And I find the pump handle quite tough on my hands, so I can only do maybe an hour or so at a time before my hands start to get too sore. But I did an hour or two yesterday and another hour or two today, probably an hour and a half each day maybe, and I've done about 50% of it. So I'm working nights the next couple of nights, but I'm hoping I might get a little bit more done tomorrow. And then I've got linseed oil coming, so I'm going to treat all of the inside of linseed oil, which is what I treated my compost bin with, and that's also supposed to help protect the wood, especially wood that's going to be in direct contact with wet substrate like soil, or in the compost bin's case, the compost. But yeah, linseed oil is, again, it's sort of an organic compound. It'll just break down naturally. It won't leach chemicals. Other things I've read you can use are things like bitumen paint, which is like a waterproof paint that people use on roofing and things like that, or black plastic that you can buy on the roll, or you can reuse like compost bags and things like that. I didn't really want to do either of them because the plastic obviously will shed microplastics into the soil, and I don't particularly want to do that. And the bitumen paint is just this like horrible solvent, chemically tar-like material that I just sounds really unpleasant to handle, but also, again, leaching chemicals into the soil over time. So I probably sound like a little bit of a weirdy beardy hippie, and I'm sure there are people listening to this who have made raised beds and used those substrates, and I don't want to come across like I'm judging anybody, so you do you if it worked for you, but I'm trying to avoid applying anything like that in the garden if I can avoid it. So having said that, I am going to paint the outside of the raised bed. It looks quite smart as it is, just as the plain board, but we're about to get new fence panels put in on one of our boundaries, and I would quite like to paint the fence panels on all the boundaries actually. One's getting replaced, but the other two are still fairly solid, I think, but we're going to paint them all the same colour, and then paint the raised bed as well. And I will be using Cuprinol for that, or something similar. I've got, I think, 5 swatches to try, like 2 that are dark blue and 3 that are various shades of grey. And yeah, so I mean, ultimately it is going to get painted, but I think partly that's for aesthetics and partly that's for what's the word, wood preservative element of it. So yeah, it's not ideal, but it's fine. Like, it's better than leaving it to potentially rot away. And like I say, this is a compromise. Like, my husband Andrew wants it to look smart, and I also want the garden to look smart, so yeah, it's fine. So I'll definitely, by the time I write this blog post, I'll have some photos of the swatches at least. Hopefully I'll have some photos of it completely finished, including painted, but we'll see. And then my plan to fill it, because obviously it's quite a deep raised bed, so if I filled the whole thing with soil it would cost me an absolute fortune. So what I'm doing is filling it with a combo of kind of vegetation. So we recently took down a holly tree that was growing way too close to the house. It would have invalidated our home insurance, which is a shame because the birds used it and I didn't really want to take it down, but we have quite a lot of trees on our property, so I don't feel too bad about the loss of one tree, but it is one that I'd noticed the birds using quite regularly, so that's a bit of a shame. I'm definitely going to have to replace it with something that will provide a similar habitat for the birds. But in taking down the holly tree, we obviously generated a large amount of green waste, and at the moment I don't have a brown waste bin. So your sort of green / brown waste from your garden, you can have a bin from the council, and the council will take it away to a sort of municipal composting place, and like shred it and compost it. And I physically have a brown bin, but you need to pay a license to use it, and I haven't organised that yet, because at this point I want to make use of as much as possible the green and brown waste myself in the garden, so composting what I can, and then reusing any bits that can't be easily composted for things like the raised beds. Or I thought I might quite like to produce some dead hedges over time, which Tanya from the Lovely Greens has a few videos on this, but basically where you stack dead branches in piles to create sort of physical hedge type barriers, but with dead plant material, and the idea is it breaks down over time and produces a habitat for like beetles and insects and birds and things like that. So I'm going to see how far into the season I get before I need to get a brown waste bin, because I'd quite like to reuse a lot of this stuff myself. But for the holly, what I've done is shredded what I can and put that on the compost bin. And then the stuff that couldn't easily be shredded is going to physically go in the bottom of the raised bed. So I'm going to do a layer of green waste and rotten wood and things like that came out of that original raised bed. And then I've got some old bits of turf that are left over from the turfing. So I'm going to put that on top to sort of weigh that all down, because that's obviously going to be full of air gaps. So that's going to settle down over time. But I figured if the turf's on top, hopefully that squidges it down as much as possible. And then I ordered a literal ton, 950 kilos to be precise, of topsoil from a local company. And that's already been screened, so it's already been riddled to remove stones and things like that. And that got delivered on Friday. So then my plan is the sort of hopefully bottom third to 2/3 will be recycled green waste, rotten wood, that kind of stuff. And then the middle third, almost up to the top, so maybe the middle third to 2/3 will be topsoil. And then I'm going to go out to a stable yard on Saturday that give away horse manure for free. So I'm going to bag up a bunch of horse manure and mix that in with the topsoil that's going to be the actual growing medium. And I've bought 4 bags of like John Innes compost when it was on offer in Tesco. Because the problem with the topsoil apparently is it doesn't necessarily contain that much by way of organic matter, like and insects and things like that. So the risk is if you plant directly into topsoil, your plants don't necessarily have all the nutrients that they need. So ideally you would mix topsoil through with some kind of organic material. So I figured that would be the horse manure and the John Innes, because the problem with horse manure by itself is it can be quite high in nitrogen depending on how well broken down it is, and then you can potentially burn the roots of your plants. So I thought if I mix that with topsoil and with John Innes, and then hopefully that'll make quite a nice growing medium, and that'll be like the top third or thereabouts. And then my plan is the section of it that's closest to the house I'm going to put my herbs in. I had created a herb bed near the house, but I don't know if it's going to get enough sun, and the dogs wander through it, which is a bit of a pain. So the bigger, more well-established herbs, I think I will leave where they are. I've got a big rosemary and a big sage, and they've already been moved once in the last 6 months because they were growing in the original veg bed that George left behind. So I've already moved them once. Don't really want to disturb them again. But I've got 3 or 4 smaller herbs that I bought as plants from Dobby's closing down sale. And technically they have been planted in the ground over the winter, but I reckon if I dig them up, they're still quite small, and plant them in the raised bed, then the bigger herbs like the sage and the rosemary are big enough that the dogs don't trample directly on them. But I've got an oregano, a thyme, a lavender, chives, and a tarragon, and the tarragon was left over from George, but I'm not 100% sure it survived. So those 5 I thought I'll transplant into the raised bed because they're small enough that I think they would be better not being trampled constantly by dogs. And then I rescued quite a lot of strawberries that were left up behind when George left as well, and they got planted. They just got whacked in the ground under the holly tree just because I needed to put them somewhere while we were laying the turf. Not quite sure how well they've come through the winter, to be honest, because again they're in quite a shaded portion of the garden. And because they were directly under the holly tree, they were getting more shade and probably not a huge amount of water, because the holly tree will have been sucking up quite a lot of water. And then in bringing down the holly tree, the strawberries obviously got quite badly trampled. So not holding out much hope for the strawberries. But I'm hoping if I sort of transplant them into the raised bed and see how they go, and then be no bad thing to buy in a few new plants anyway, because I've read that you should be adding new plants every year when your older plants sort of get too old, basically. And there's a local lady on Facebook Marketplace that I bought a bunch of plants from, who I've noticed is selling strawberry runners, so I might go back to her and maybe buy a handful of strawberry plants just to like plump up my poor sad ones that got mashed. And then half the rhubarb I'm going to put back in as well. And I'd quite like to grow asparagus, but asparagus is quite a long-term proposition because it's takes 3 years before you can harvest it. So I'm not sure if I'm ready to commit to that just yet in my first season of gardening. But I'd like to grow radishes and salad leaves and carrots, things that I'll eat in like salads. And then come the autumn, I'd quite like to plant garlic and onions as well. So so that's all very exciting. I'm very excited to get to the part where I can actually start filling it, because I've got these piles of just rubbish lying around in the front and back garden. I've got a giant pile of cardboard to go in there. I've got loads of plants that we've had to dig out from various places that were in the way of like laying turf and things like that I've saved to go in the bottom of the raised bed. I've got loads of rotten wood, all the old holly tree. So the process of filling the raised bed is just going to be quite a satisfying one in terms of like just tidying up the property a little bit. But also, yeah, it's going to be super satisfying to finally be able to plant things, which will be amazing. And then my next plan after that is to build a mini raised bed in the greenhouse and a mini raised bed along the outside of the greenhouse to keep the dogs from running through the glass. They haven't done it yet, but there's been a couple of moments where they've been like playing rough by the by the greenhouse, and I've thought this could quite easily get out of control and somebody could get hurt. And my granny had a dog, granted like 40 odd years ago, that literally ran through a greenhouse, ran through a pane of glass and cut herself quite badly, understandably. She survived, but yeah, we would quite like to avoid that if we can. So yeah, I thought if I build a mini raised bed on the outside of the greenhouse that'll act as like a barrier for the dogs, and then a raised bed inside the greenhouse as well, because the soil growing medium in the greenhouse looks really sad. It's like super compacted, super dry. So I think it probably needs dug over and a bunch of like horse manure and topsoil mixed in and compost. But eventually in the greenhouse I'd quite like to grow chilies and peppers and tomatoes. So yeah, might need to get cracking on that, because I've only got 4 weeks or thereabouts before ideally I'd be planting all of this stuff. But yeah, I will leave it there because I think we're well over half an hour, and hopefully that is plenty gardening chat to get on with. If you've built raised beds in the past, let me know what you did, how you painted it, did you seal them on the inside, what did you use, did it work, how long did they last? So many questions. Would love to hear from you all, and otherwise thanks so much for listening and supporting and commenting and liking, and thank you so much to everybody who's donated to my Buy Me a Coffee. I had another one this week, which was very lovely. I think ultimately that money is going to get spent on plants. I can see it happening, but yeah, thanks again so much for joining me, and I will speak to you all next week. Bye.